Hello again, everybody. For those of you who have heard Kirill Ospovat speak before, you will understand what I mean when I say that I am excited to have him talk to us today. I would like to remind you all who he is briefly. Kirill Ospovat is an assistant professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's author of Terror and Pity, Aleksandr Sumarokov and the Theater of Power in Elizabethan Russia, and more recently, Pridvornaia slovesnost, Institut literatury и konstruktsii absoliutizma в Rossii, serediny XVIII veka. I have this beauty with me. Here it is. His next book, which I guess we're getting a little bit of a taste of today, will explore the social aspects of Russian sentimental fiction through close readings of Karamzin, Gogol, and Dostoevsky. And we are also lucky to have today as our discussant, Ekaterina Lyamina, who is professor at the School of Philological Studies at the Higher School of Economics. Professor Lyamina's interests are in the areas of 18th and 19th century Russian history, culture, and literature, Russo-French cultural contacts, ego documents, as well as Pushkin and his time. Along with many articles on these topics, Professor Lyamina is author of Бедный Жозеф, Жизнь и смерть Иосифа Виллегорского, Опыт биографии человека 1830-х годов в соавторстве с Натальей Самовер. Okay, so I will pass the baton over to Kirill, who will speak to us about Poor Liza, Russia's sentimental marketplace. Please, Kirill. Unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Ilya. Thank you, Sasha. Thanks to the Jordan Center for hosting me. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So yes, this is today I will be presenting you part of my next book project, which concerns the social and economic aspects of Russian sentimental fiction. The book will be basically three close readings of three texts: Poor Liza, Starosvetsky помещики, the Old World Landowners, by Gogol, and Dostoevsky's Poor Folk, which we well know is a work of sentimental naturalism, right? And this talk is indeed meant as I'm very grateful for everyone who joined us, to Professor Lyamina for agreeing to be my discussant. This talk is meant as provocation for a conversation. So I'm very much look forward to arguments and counter arguments. And I'm really glad that I get to give this talk at a stage where on the one hand, kind of my chapter is on Poor Liza is almost finished. On the other hand, there is still much work to be done in terms of book projects. So I will be able to profit from all the feedback and to really kind of have a space to consider all the different thoughts and reactions that you might have. So today I will present my reading of Poor Liza, Karamzin's Poor Liza. Its poetics and its cultural and intellectual context, both Russian and European. The talk is obviously much shorter than the chapter, so what follows is the bare bones of my argument. I will try to present its most central points and comment on the most important aspects and episodes of Karamzin's tale, and in the discussion, I will be happy to go into specifics both in terms of the text's internal structure and its various contexts. As I will argue throughout the paper, the plot and effective structure of Poor Liza cannot be understood without taking into account its economic aspects. Economic readings of Karamzin's fiction, and specifically Poor Liza, have been offered on the one hand in the earlier Soviet scholarship, and there are still valuable insights there hidden behind the very much warped official Soviet idiom, but most recently in English by Natalia Khokholova and Tatiana Smolerova, who wrote on Karamzin's translation from Marmontel in their economic context. Developing their insights, I link Poor Liza to pan-European debates on commerce, luxury, and poverty. While this argument must be supported by evidence from Karamzin's authorial biography, thus we know that he was an avid reader of Adam Smith, my claims are not limited to a specific author or text. Indeed, building on ample recent scholarship, which has uncovered social and economic aspects of Western sentimental fiction, I proceed from the premise that sentimentalism as an artistic mode must be read together with concurrent developments in moral, social, aesthetic, and economic theory. A central figure in this constellation is, of course, Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of Nations, 1776, and The Theory of Moral Sentiments from 1759, a core work of sentimental moral philosophy, which already included the famous vision of the market's invisible hand. The widely shared conjunction of economic thought with sentimental affective emplotment can be demonstrated on an economic text by another patron saint of European sentimentalism, namely Rousseau's 1755 Discourse on Political Economy. I look upon any poor man, writes Rousseau, as totally undone if he has the misfortune to have an honest heart, a fine daughter, and a powerful neighbor. Industry and commerce draw all the money from the country into the capitals. Thus, the richer the city, the poorer the country. Only trading cities are sensible of abundance, while the peasant only becomes relatively poorer. It is by such taxes, indeed, by which the poor are eased and the burdens thrown on the rich, that is possible to prevent the continual increase of inequality of fortune, the subjection of such a multitude of artisans and useless servants to the rich, the multiplications of idle persons in our cities, and the depopulation of the countryside. So what I'm interested here is not as much Rousseau's measures that he suggests to remedy the situation as much as his diagnosis of it, right? Kind of the economic condition of the city and the country. In a nutshell, this passage demonstrates the fundamental link between political economy and sentimental narrative imagination. Rousseau is describing the socio-economic condition of the ongoing devastation of the country by the city, a condition which, as Raymond Williams shows in his eponymous study, was central both for real-life economy and the social imaginary of the era. This devastation is linked to luxury, a multifaceted concept which associated the commercial redistribution of wealth with the superfluous, useless consumption of urban elites and the corresponding moral corruption. This moral and economic constellation underlies the archetypical sentimental plot of Rousseau's first sentence. I look upon any poor man as totally undone if he has the misfortune to have an honest heart, a fine daughter, and a powerful neighbor. The failings of the economic order are now represented by a personalized, if anonymous, figure of the peasant with an honest heart, whose daughter and her chastity are threatened by the wealthy neighbor. Rousseau summarizes here the most commonplace sentimental plot of all, wherein, to quote Terry Eagleton's readings of Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, I quote, "Sexuality, far from being some displacement of class conflict, is the very medium in which it is conducted," unquote. The story of the peasant, his daughter, and the neighbor unfolds under the gaze, or in the imagination, of a spectator, a gaze shared with the reader and defined by the ultimate sentimental affect of compassion. Sentimental storytelling and its emotional effect are firmly tied into analysis of the evolving social order. Obviously, Poor Liza enacts a very similar plot. After the death of her hardworking father, a poor peasant girl is forced to go to Moscow to sell flowers. There she meets Erast, who is willing to pay an excessive price for her work. Despite her mother's apprehensions, Liza falls in love with Erast and has sex with him. Physical satisfaction diminishes Erast's passion for Liza. He leaves for war and marries a rich widow to cover his gambling debt. Once Liza learns this, Erast bribes her with a huge sum of 100 rubles, and Liza commits suicide by throwing herself into a pond at the Simonov Monastery. As Gitta Hammerberg concludes in her authoritative study, the title of Poor Liza, I quote, already indicates the tale's double focus, both Liza's misfortunes and the narrator's compassionate nature. It is furthermore ambiguous in that it could also refer to Liza's economic state. Poverty is what leads to her first meeting with Erast and their subsequent seller-buyer relationship, unquote. In Hammerberg's study, this crucial observation is not developed further, as if the tale's economic aspects are of no concern to the literary scholar. I would suggest, however, to repeat my claim once again, that the narrative form of the sentimental tale is defined and made relevant by an amalgamation of aesthetic, moral, and economic concerns. In Poor Liza, this amalgamation is manifested in the tale's exposition, which precedes its plot and provides a crucial background for its development. This exposition is centered on the story's narrator. Может быть, никто из живущих в Москве не знает так хорошо окрестности города сего, как я, потому что никто чаще моего не бывает в поле, никто более моего не бродит пешком, без плана, без цели, куда глаза глядят, по лугам, по рощам, по холмам и равнинам. Of course, this narrator is an archetypical figure of sentimental interiority. We may recall Rousseau's Reveries of the Solitary Walker as a classic example of this archetype. However, besides a particular mode of contemplating nature and one's selfhood, Karamzin's wandering narrator represents a particular social type. The figure of the spectator, as the famous title of Joseph Addison's periodical from 1711 makes clear, was central for emerging visions of the cultural and social order. This theoretical position had a clear economic dimension. The spectatorship was appropriate for an idle and enlightened nobleman, landowner, designated in Samuel Johnson's well-known periodicals, often translated in 18th century Russia as the Rambler, the Adventurer, and the Idler. Accordingly, the self-portrait of Poor Liza's idling and wandering narrator, which might appear as private and even intimate, is at the same time a first-person account of a fashionable social practice of strolling in the city's rural environs. Karamzin himself made no secret of this. In his later essay «Записки старого московского жителя» from 1802, he outlined the taste for nature emerging among different classes of Muscovites. Первые шаги общежития удаляют человека от натуры, а дальнейшие снова приводят его к ней. Старинные русские бояре не заглядывали в деревни, не имели загородных домов. Какая розница с нынешним временем, когда Москва совершенно пустеет летом, когда всякий дворянин, насытившись зимой городскими удовольствиями, при начале весны спешит в село слышать первый голос жаворонка или соловья. Поезжайте в воскресенье на Воробьевы горы к Симонову монастырю, в Сокольники, везде множество гуляющих. Еще не так давно я бродил уединенно по живописным окрестностям Москвы и думал с сожалением, какие места, и никто не наслаждается ими, а теперь везде нахожу общество. Unquote. Both here and in Poor Liza, the wandering sentimental narrator partakes even in solitude in a fashionable behavior, epitomizing the newly civilized condition of Russia's society. In a logic evocative of Schiller's definition of the sentimental, a socially accepted taste for nature is itself seen as a product of a developed stage of civilization. The very concept of nature was lacking, according to Karamzin, in the language of old Russian boyars. Explicating the historical conditions of his own predilections and practices, the ancient Moscow dweller feels compelled to trace Russia's progress in the 18th century. Слава нынешнему просвещению и великим успехам его в Москве белокаменной. Sounds like Sorokin in the 21st century. We can discern a similar social and historical analysis. While we usually assume the sentimental gaze is exclusively concerned with nature and private emotions, both in the notes of the Moscow dweller and in Poor Liza, the sentimental gaze is directed at the Russian polity in its social and historical development. Но всего приятнее для меня то место, на котором возвышаются мрачные готические башни Симонова монастыря. Стоя на сей горе, видишь на правой стороне почти всю Москву, сию ужасную громаду домов и церквей. За ними по желтым пескам течет светлая река, шумящая под рулем грузных стругов, которые плывут от плодоноснейших стран Российской империи и наделяют алчную Москву хлебом. Страшно воют ветры в стенах опустевшего монастыря. Иногда вхожу в кельи и представляю себе тех, которые в них жили, печальные картины. Все сие обновляет в моей памяти историю нашего Отечества, печальную историю тех времен, когда свирепые татары и литовцы огнем и лечом опустошали окрестности российской столицы. Various nuances of Gothic and sublime affects accompany and attenuate a vision of historical progress leading from Russia's medieval political dismemberment and religious asceticism to the current grandeur of the Russian Empire and its capital, Moscow. This current imperial state, witnessed by the narrator, is associated with trade, commerce, and abundance. The image of the waterways, which supply the city with agrarian production, was central to portrayals of trade in literary works such as James Thompson's The Seasons, loosely translated by Karamzin. It also appears in economic texts, including the most famous of them all, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Good roads, canals, and navigable rivers, by diminishing the expense of carriage, put the remote parts of the country more nearly upon a level with those in the neighborhood of the town. The great commerce of every civilized society is that carried out between the inhabitants of the town and those of the country. We must not imagine that the gain of the town is the loss of the country. The gains of both are mutual and reciprocal. And the division of labor is in this, as in all other cases, advantageous to all different persons employed in the various occupations in which it is subdivided. Unquote. The spatial image of the river supplying the city with bread is thus associated with the same fundamental economic relationship between city and country that we have encountered in Rousseau. Smith's passage suggests a balance of mutual advantage, an economic theodicy designated by the notion of the market's invisible hand. Karamzin's language offers different perspectives on this relationship. Moscow's role in economic exchange is defined by two expressive epithets, ужасное и алчное, terrifying and avaricious. The description of Moscow, and specifically the epithet ужасный, activates the resources of the sublime, defined in aesthetic theory from Edmund Burke to Kant as the contemplation of a phenomenon so powerful it is threatening to human life. This threat is linked by Karamzin to the city's capacity for economic absorption. Undermining his own optimism and agreeing with Rousseau, Smith admits in another passage of The Wealth of Nations that the wealth of the city can actually be ruinous to the country. I quote, a city might grow up to great wealth and splendor, while not only the country in its neighborhood, but all those to which it traded were in poverty and wretchedness. Unquote. This is what ruins Liza and her family. The sublime threat implied in the portrayal of the ужасная Москва is of a fundamentally economic nature and fulfills itself in the ruin of an archetypical country girl. Отец Лизин был довольно зажиточный поселянин, потому что он любил работу, пахал хорошо землю и всегда вел трезвую жизнь. Но скоро по смерти его жена и дочь обедняли. Ленивая рука наемника худо обрабатывала поле, и хлеб перестал хорошо родиться. Они принуждены были отдать свою землю в наем за весьма небольшие деньги. Лиза, не щадя своей нежной молодости, не щадя редкой красоты своей, трудилась день и ночь, ткала холсты, вязала чулки, весной рвала цветы, летом брала ягоды и продавала их в Москве. Liza's father is far removed from usual portrayals of Russia's serfs, deprived of their agency by the owner and the commune. Instead, he represents the idealized vision of an individual farmer, a proprietor of his own land, a vision which was central to models of a proper agrarian economy, both in Smith and in Catherine's Nakaz, which antedated The Wealth of Nations, but resonated with some of its ideas. Karamzin commented on the Nakaz and its agrarian chapters in The Historical Eulogy of Catherine II from 1802. This is how Smith describes his perfect rural worker. A small proprietor who knows every part of his little territory, who views it all with the affection which property, especially small property, naturally inspires, and who upon that account takes pleasure not only in cultivating but in adorning it, is generally of all improvers the most industrious, the most intelligent, and the most successful. Unquote. However, as Smith admits, this success cannot be inherited. In commercial societies, riches very seldom remain long in the same family. Poor independent workman, I'm commenting kind of further on the fact that Liza's mother Liza had to hire a workman, right? A poor independent workman, writes Smith, will generally be more industrious than even a journeyman who works by the piece. The one enjoys the whole produce of his own industry, the other shares it with his master. This is just one passage in Smith illustrating the fact that hired labor is by nature less effective than that of its owner. So if this is true, a peasant family which loses its male worker is doomed to economic ruin by the forces of the market. What is left to Liza is to earn her living serving the demands of urban luxury, which, as both Rousseau and Smith admit, was the driving force of modern economy. Луга покрылись цветами, и Лиза пришла в Москву с ландышами. Молодой, хорошо одетый человек приятного вида встретился ей на улице. Она показала ему цветы и закраснелась. «Ты продаешь их, девушка?» – спросил он с улыбкой. «Продаю», – отвечала она. In this scene, we are confronted with a sentimental commerce, the intertwinement of commercial transactions and the circulation of emotion that will define the rest of the narrative. Arast's recognition of Liza as a seller of goods becomes inseparable from the mutual sympathy which arises between two young people. Lilies of the Valley, sold by Liza, place her and Arast in the same social and economic world with the narrator of Poor Liza and the notes of the Old Moscow Dweller. In the notes, Karamzin's reflection on the recent successes of Russia's enlightenment and trade is provoked by a woman selling lilies of the valley. Господин, не надобно ли вам цветов? Так на моей памяти образовалась в нашей столице, Москве, сия новая отрасль торговли. На моей памяти стали продавать здесь ландыши. Из чего мы, философы, заключаем, что московские жители просветились, ибо любовь к сельским цветам есть любовь к натуре, а любовь к натуре предполагает вкус нежный, утонченный, искусственный. Similar to the narrator, his personal friend, Arast represents the social type or class of enlightened urbanites whose moral attributes and aesthetic tastes are not separable from their economic behavior and specifically modes of consumption. Arast's treatment of Liza is driven by luxury as an economic and moral condition much more than by his personal malice. Сей Араст был довольно богатый дворянин с изрядным разумом и добрым сердцем, добрым от природы, но слабым и ветреным. Он вел рассеянную жизнь, думал только о своем удовольствии, искал его в светских забавах, но часто не находил. Скучал и жаловался на судьбу свою. This characterization, which starts with Arast's wealth, brings out the alignment of moral and economic issues in the pursuit of pleasure, which has become a way of life for the wealthy urban class. Just as the story's narrator, Arast is not as much a unique personality as a model homo economicus, a type of historically and socially conditioned existence. In one of the adventure essays, Samuel Johnson provides a detailed portrayal of the social type. When we observe the lives of those whom an ample inheritance had let loose to their own direction, what do we discover that can excite our envy? Their time seems not to pass with much applause from others or satisfaction to themselves. Many squander their exuberance of fortune in luxury and debauchery. Others lie down to sleep and rise up to trifle, are employed every morning in finding expedients to rid themselves of the day, chase pleasure through all the places of public resort, always endeavoring to raise some new desire, that they may have something to pursue, to rekindle some hope, which they know will be disappointed, changing one amusement for another, which a few months will make equally insipid, or sinking into languor and disease for want of something to actuate their bodies or exhilarate their minds, unquote. Karamzin's Arast shares with Johnson adventure a common pattern of desire, which defines their social and economic behaviors as much as it governs their psyche. A whole class of wealthy men who do not have to worry about subsistence are plagued by an impossibility to find satisfaction and by a constant need to search for new pleasures. It is this drive associated with luxury which underlies Arast's economically inflected interest in the lilies of the valley and Liza herself. А что тебе надо? 5 копеек. Это слишком дешево. Вот тебе рубль. Лиза удивилась, осмелилась взглянуть на молодого человека, еще более закраснелась, потупив глаза в землю, сказала ему, что не возьмет рубля. Для чего же? Мне не надобно лишнего. Я думаю, что прекрасные ландыши, сорванные руками прекрасной девушки, стоят рубля. Когда же ты не берешь его, вот тебе 5 копеек. Я хотел бы всегда покупать у тебя цветы, хотел бы, чтобы ты рвала их только для меня. Arast's insistence on raising the price of the flowers seems to contradict any kind of economic logic. In fact, however, it can be read as an allegory of price formation in the economy of luxury. According to Johnson, the desires of the wealthy are often attracted to something which is not required by any real want of nature, which has not in itself any power of gratification, and which neither reason nor fancy would have prompted us to wish did we not see it in the possession of others, unquote. Quite similarly, in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith describes the modern economic condition as shaped by the fact that by the improvement and cultivation of land, the labor of half the society becomes sufficient to provide food for the whole, so that others can be employed in providing other things or in satisfying the other wants and fancies of mankind. These wants and fancies, such as clothing and lodging, household furniture, and what is called equipage, are contrasted with food necessary for survival. While the demand for food is equal for all, I quote, the rich man consumes no more food than his poor neighbor, the excessive wants and fancies of the rich create and drive an economy of luxury. Those who have the command of more food than they themselves can consume are always willing to exchange their surplus, or what is the same thing, the price of it, for gratification of this other kind. What is over and above satisfying the limited desire is given for the amusement of those desires which cannot be satisfied, but seem to be altogether endless. The poor, in order to obtain food, exert themselves to gratify those fancies of the rich. Unquote. This dynamic shapes the very definition of value. The concept itself must be divided into value in use and value in exchange, which is market price. The things which have the greatest value in use have frequently little or no value in exchange. On the contrary, those which have the greatest value in exchange have frequently little or no value in use. Nothing is more useful than water, but it will purchase scarce anything. Scarce anything can be had in exchange for it. A diamond, on the contrary, has scarce any value in use, but a very great quantity of other goods may frequently be had in exchange for it. In this example, the diamond represents the centrality of luxury for economy as such. The value in exchange, the market price, depends not on the necessity of goods for survival, but on the value ascribed to them by the fancies of the rich. Similar to the other poor, Liza comes to depend on these fancies for subsistence. While leaders of the valley have scarce any value in use, they represent, Karamzin tells us, a longing for nature developed by the urban consumer class, incorporating the contrast between the usefulness of a commodity and its economic value created by imagination. Liza's flowers serve, in Smith's terms, I quote, for the amusement of those desires which cannot be satisfied, but seem to be altogether endless. Liza's, unquote, Liza's interaction with the Rust, which from the start assumed the form of a bargain, directly correspond to the economic disproportions, which according to Smith, drive the process of price formation. A rural laborer must work to satisfy the fancies of the urban consumer to earn her subsistence. This interaction is centered around the acquired object, the flowers and Liza herself. Rust's offer to acquire exclusive rights over Liza's labor and her produce illustrates a vision of wealth as class power outlined by Smith. Departing from Hobbes' claim that wealth is power, Smith explained that the power granted by property is the power of purchasing, a certain command over all labor or over all the produce of labor which is then at the market. His, a wealthy man's fortune, is greater or less precisely in proportion to the extent of this power or to the quantity either of other men's labor or what is the same thing of the produce of other men's labor, which enables him to purchase for a man. Subjected to Rust's purchasing power, Liza becomes amalgamated with her produce. Rust's dual, sentimental and commercial interactions with Liza, a duality which was inherent in 18th century English terms, commerce and intercourse, cannot be reduced to the satisfaction of his lust, even if it's obviously their central moment. Instead, his feelings for Liza correspond to the dynamic of a fundamentally insatiable desire outlined by Johnson and Smith. Just as leaders of the valley designate a sentimental taste for nature as a powerful and yet imaginary, fictitious longing of the urban consumer, Rust's affair with Liza is at first dominated by sentimental fantasies of chastity. Красота Лизы при первой встрече сделала впечатление в его сердце. Он читал романы, идиллии, имел довольно живое воображение и часто переселялся мысленно в те времена, бывшие или не бывшие, в которые, если верить стихотворцам, все люди беспечно гуляли по лугам, купались в чистых источниках, целовались как горлицы, отдыхали под розами и миртами и в счастливой праздности все дни свои провожали. Ему казалось, что он нашел в Лизе то, чего сердце его давно искало. Натура призывает меня в свои объятия к чистым своим радостям. Думал, он решился, по крайней мере, на время, оставить большой свет. Они обнимались, но целомудренная, стыдливая Цинтия не скрывалась от них за облако, чистые и непорочны были их объятия. Раст восхищался своей пастушкой, так называл Лизу, и, видя, сколь она любит его, казался сам себе любезнее. Here, a self-conscious critique of sentimental writing, the novels and idylls that Rust reads, is aligned with an analysis of moral, social, and economic workings of desire. To understand its implications, we must turn to the second of Adam Smith's major works, the theory of moral sentiments. If in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith explains price formation through collective events of the urban consumers, in the theory of moral sentiments, he develops a theory of social judgment, which assigns value to sentiments, acts, and people, a moral theory of price, so to speak. Anticipating this his economic discussion of luxury in the later work, Smith develops in the theory of moral sentiments an analysis of desire and sexual passion, which revolves around the same contrast between physical needs and value conferred on objects and sentiments by public imagination. The public feels aversion for all appetites which take their origin from the body, including the passion by which nature unites the two sexes. This passion appears to everybody, but the man who feels it entirely disproportionate to the value of the object. Love, which in Smith's English turns a fellow human into an object, is thus subordinated to the general workings of value and public opinion, or value assigned by public opinion. Public imagination, the ultimate arbiter of value, refuses to endorse the amorous passion as long as its physical elements remain visible. And that is a quote on your screens. The grossness of that passion, which mixes with and is perhaps the foundation of love, disappears when its gratification is far off and in the distance, but renders the whole offensive when described as what is immediately possessed. Thus, Erast's peculiar insistence on a platonic relationship with Liza is defined as much by accepted social protocols of status and reputation as by his wish to escape from them in nature. Admiring Liza, Erast казался сам себе любезнее. The same socially accepted patterns of desire inform the demand for sentimental fiction. If, according to Smith, the public does not sympathize with immediate sexual possession, it does have a taste for expectations of romantic happiness. I quote, "We feel how natural it is for the mind in a certain situation, relaxed with indolence and fatigued with the violence of desire, to long for serenity and quiet, to hope to find them in the gratification of that passion which distracts it, and to frame to itself the idea of that life of pastoral tranquility and retirement, which the elegant, the tender, and the passionate Tibullus take so much pleasure in describing. A life like what the poets describe in the Fortunate Islands, a life of friendship, liberty, and repose, free from labor, and from care, and from all the turbulent passions which attend them," unquote. Pastoral fantasies produced by poets are made possible and popular by a specific moral and social economy which values products of imagination over physical needs. Avert fictionality is a necessary element of social desire which assigns value to Liza by turning her into an idyllic peasant existing beyond gross passion. This aestheticide figure produced by the sentimental imagination and far removed from Liza's actual economic condition that we know of, is this figure is the fantastic object, the fictitious good that Erast praises at a ruble instead of 5 kopecks that Liza asked for her flowers. Liza's ruin is dictated by the same moral and social dynamics which expose her to the desires of a rich man. According to Smith, despite all social censure, the love of ease, of pleasure, and other selfish gratification is always easy to restrain for a single moment or even for a short period of time, but by their continual solicitations, they often mislead us into many weaknesses, which we have afterwards much reason to be ashamed of, unquote. Our collective aversion for bodily appetites and their victims is derived not from a higher principle of ascetic morality, such as that could be represented by Karamzin's depiction of ancient monks, but from the transient experience of sensual gratification. So we don't, we kind of disapprove of overt sexuality, not because the society is moral, but because sensual gratification is a very fleeting experience. To the person himself, who feels them the appetites of the body, as soon as they're gratified, the object that excited them ceases to be agreeable. Even its presence often becomes offensive to him. He looks round to no purpose for the charm which transported him at the moment before, and he can now as little enter into his own passion as another person. When we have dined, we order the covers to be removed. And of course, this charm is very much related to the aesthetic appeal of sentimental works, Tibullus, and other poets that Smith mentioned. Okay, accordingly, from this kind of following similar logic, Karamzin's narrative easily proceeds from Erast's purposeful abstention to his failure to control his desire and the aversion that follows from it. Она бросилась в его объятия, и всей час надлежало погибнуть непорочности. Свидания продолжались, но как все переменилось. Эраст не мог уже доволен быть одними невинными ласками своей Лизы. Кто знает сердце свое, кто размышлял о свойстве нежнейших его удовольствий, тот, конечно, согласится со мной, что исполнение всех желаний есть самое опасное искушение любви. Лиза не была уже для Эраста сим ангелом непорочности, который прежде воспалял его воображение и восхищал душу. Erast's behavior confirms Smith's analysis of desire and luxurious consumption, which can never settle on tangible gratification, but are constantly fueled by fancy. Ангел непорочности, right, as an imaginary creature. In Liza's fall, imagination of this kind, perpetuated by sentimental fictions of chastity and virtue, is revealed as a fragile disguise for social, moral, and economic forces, which may well be out of control of the weak Erast, but are in any case powerful enough to destroy Liza. And what about Liza herself? Or as Karamzin puts it, обратимся к Лизе. Very much aware of the dangers of dealing with urban men, she depends on their fancies for survival. Sharing Erast's passion, she becomes for a moment his equal in an imaginary fictitious space outside society, but at this very moment, she is exposed to disproportions that shape and define the most private sentimental commerce. It is she who reminds Erast that they cannot marry because she is a peasant, even though existing legislation explicitly permitted such marriages, and the force she must submit to is that of accepted custom. Indeed, it is society with its system of judgment, theorized by Adam Smith in the Theory of Moral Sentiment, that dictates Liza's ruin. We see this society famously designated in the Theory of Moral Sentiments by the concept of the impartial spectator during Liza's first encounter with Erast. Молодой человек не хотел удерживать ее, может быть, для того, что мимоходящие начали останавливаться и, смотря на них, коварно улыбались. While the passers-by, alienated and yet threateningly perspicacious, have no idea about Erast or Liza as individuals and no political power over them, the public opinion is invested with an immense, omnipresent force of censure and approval, or, in Smith's own terms, approbation. The narrator seems to be addressing this collective authority when he conveys Erast's repentance in the last lines of Poor Liza. But I would like to focus on Liza. Outlining his vision of collectively accepted morality, Smith admits the disproportion in how sexual transgression is judged in men and women. For the fair sex, Smith writes, breach of chastity dishonors irretrievably. No circumstances, no solicitation can excuse it. No sorrow, no repentance atone for it. We are so nice in this respect that even a rape dishonors, and the innocence of the mind cannot in our imagination wash out the pollution of the body. The conceptual emphasis lies on the pronouns we and ours. What is at stake is a system of collective judgment, which every member of society must interiorize. Accordingly, in the famous scene of Liza's fall, her own fulfilled desire is accompanied by tropes of guilt. Она бросилась в его объятия, и всей час надлежало погибнуть непорочности. «Ах, я боюсь, — говорила Лиза, — боюсь того, что случилось с нами. Мне казалось, что я умираю, что душа моя...» Между тем блеснула молния, грянул гром, Лиза вся задрожала, и раз-то раз сказала она: «Мне страшно, я боюсь, чтобы гром не убил меня, как преступницу». Грозно шумела буря, дождь лился из черных облаков, казалось, что натура сетовала о потерянной Лизиной невинности. Both Liza and the narrator evoke metaphysical censure for sexual transgression. Far from endorsing the ancient ascetic morality of the monks, Karamzin instead uses the trope of divine punishment as a figure of Liza's own imagination, shaped by the society she inhabits and adopted by the narrator as a rhetorical ornament, an unreliable and yet expressive figure of speech. Казалось, что натура сетовала, right? It's only the narrator who chooses to present it this way. Similarly, Smith derives visions of hell and paradise and I quote, in every religion and in every superstition from social norms which depend on punishing transgression. So punishment in the afterlife, according to Smith, is explicitly a fiction produced by different societies at different stages of their development. At the center of Smithian ethics, we find the subject who anticipates the society's collective verdict over their actions, a verdict which might be couched in terms of divine punishment. And such a model subject we encounter in Liza. Her final gesture, suicide, should be understood in a similar vein. Having encountered the newly married Erast, who pays her a huge sum of 100 rubles to go away, Liza wanders around. Мне нельзя жить, думала она, нельзя, если бы упало на меня небо, если бы земля поглотила бедную, нет, небо не падает, земля не колеблется, горе мне. Она осмотрелась вокруг себя, увидела своего соседа, увидела дочь своего соседа, кликнула ее, вынула из кармана 10 империалов, подавала ей, сказала: любезная Анюта, любезная подружка, отнеси эти деньги к матушке, они не крадены, скажи, что Элиза против нее виновата, что таила от нее любовь к своему одному жестокому человеку, скажи, что изменил мне, попроси, чтобы она меня простила. Тут она бросилась в воду. In Liza's tormented state, a painful sense of amorous loss is accompanied and magnified by another not so private emotion, an unbearable sense of guilt. Liza once again invokes well-known tropes of divine punishment, falling skies and devouring earth, and speaks of her guilt before her mother, who embodies in this case patriarchal authority. The mother isn't even present there. She is this imaginary figure of this judge, right? Liza's love life becomes consequential in the light of social norms, which define it as a transgression and impose this view on the woman. As Smith puts it, breaches of the rule of chastity, at least in one of the sexes, obviously we know which one, tend to bring ignominy upon the person who has been guilty of them, and consequently to be attended in the scrupulous with some degree of shame and contrition of mind. Some degree can be read as a British understatement here. Trivial as it is for sentimental fiction, Liza's suicide is not a singular anecdote, but a systemic consequence of a particular moral and social order where individual existences and sentiments are governed by economic inequality, commercial transactions, and collective censure. These forces define the aesthetic impact, the aesthetic interest, of sentimental fiction as practiced by Karamzin and Poor Liza. Under the name of tragedy, Adam Smith theorized an aesthetic mode which encourages the presumably male-dominated audience to enjoy images of female shape. The reserve which the laws of society impose upon the fair sex with regard to this weakness, love, renders it more peculiarly distressful in them and upon account more deeply interesting. We are charmed with the love of Phaedra as it is expressed in the French tragedy of that name, notwithstanding all the extravagance and guilt which attended. That very extravagance and guilt may be said in some measure to recommend it to us. Her fear, her shame, her remorse, her horror, her despair become thereby more natural and interesting. Unquote. In Poor Liza, Karamzin spectacularly enacts this pattern, making his heroine seem natural and interesting to the extent that her ruin illustrates the dominating modes of social discipline and division of labor. Our own compassion for Liza, or at least that of Karamzin's first readers, becomes entangled in the moral and commercial order that is so explicitly responsible for her death. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirill. I will straight away pass the word to Ekaterina Levina, please.
Thank you, Ilya. As agreed, I will speak in Russian, and Kirill then will summarize my words shortly. Спасибо за пространное и в то же время сжатое выступление. Я нахожу вполне обоснованной вашу логику и полагаю, что историко-экономическая генеалогия Раста и описание его отношений с Лизой, его отношения к Лизе вполне могут быть интерпретированы как не только и не столько социальные, но и экономически детерминированные. Понятно, что ключевыми концептами здесь будет роскошь, потребление роскоши, желание обладания и так далее. Однако обрисованный фон, а именно статья в l'Encyclopédie, в трактатах Смита, о которых вы говорили, это все-таки контекст вполне монотонного и однопланового свойства. А как быть с беллетристическим контекстом? Ведь перед нами все же не трактат в виде повести, но повесть, соответствующим образом, по-видимому, сформулированными задачами. Или нет? Или перед нами действительно мини-экономический, ну, понятно, да, говоря экономический, я без сомнения упрощаю. В этой связи мне, например, страшно интересно, как быть со шлейфом прямых подражаний бедной Лизе, которые, как известно, варьируют вот эту центральную ситуацию. Иногда, скажем, одна из десятков, да, некто Брусилов, написавший историю бедной Марьи. Марья, дочь состоятельного откупщика, венчается с богатым купцом, которого зовут Эраст, а ее, так сказать, бедный крестьянин Милон в сцене венчания взглянул на нее страстно и пронзил сердце свое кинжалом. Да, вот насколько, так сказать, понятно, что это вещи другого уровня, но я говорю не об уровне сейчас, а о том, насколько существенно вот этот экономический каркас, который вы выводите для бедной Лизы, насколько он существен для подражателей Карамзина. Вот. Это как бы первая группа вопросов, которые ваше замечательное выступление вызывает. Следующая группа вопросов и разного рода соображений возникает в связи с фигурой наратора, конечно. Вы сказали, что он друг Эраста, personal friend, но я думаю, что он скорее знакомец и во всяком случае конфидент, это правда. Он считывает и фактически эксплицирует подоплеку всей истории, фактически эксплицирует. Ну, это все равно еще требует дополнительной экспликации, но она есть. Неизбежность трагической развязки. Но означает ли это, что он так хорошо понимает Эраста, потому что он потребитель того же типа? Или если он выключен из этой системы, не знаю за счет чего, но тем не менее, то, по-видимому, именно за счет своей выключенности он обретает вот эту рефлективную функцию, которая столь важна. Почему он передает нам эту историю столь сложным образом? Ну, я, так сказать, только какие-то главные вещи обозначу, да, это речевые партии героев весьма разработанные, инфильтрация этих речевых партий в речь наратора и вся замечательно, так сказать, отшлифованная карамзинская синтактика, синтагматика, в общем, все то, что описал Виноградов в свое время и многие после него. И в этом смысле возникает вопрос, ну, извините мне, категории советского литературоведения, но все-таки я себе их здесь позволю. Вот художественное совершенство, не избыточно ли оно в данном случае? И, наконец, последнее, о чем меня заставил думать ваш спич, это следующее. Чем все же объяснить мощный гуманистический эффект этого текста? По-видимому, не сводимый к тем эмоциям, которые перечисляет Смит применительно к Федоре. Такие эмоции – это слегка злорадные, скажем прямо. Да? Между тем, Лиза, бедная, безусловно, находится в реестре, в золотом фонде, может быть, даже, тех текстов, которые учат науке сострадания. Не злорадство. У Смита вот в том пассаже из трактата, который вы приводили, взгляд своего рода расчленяющий. Русское же чтение, которому, не знаю, разумеется, как вы пишете свою книгу, но полагаю, что все-таки, по-видимому, вы полагаете, что Карамзин для Гоголя и для Достоевского своего рода матрица. Ну, переосмысляемая. Естественно, это мое предположение, вы вправе его опровергнуть. Но, тем не менее, русское чтение этой истории, по-видимому, синтезирующего типа, расширяющее понятие бедности до символического статуса и активно востребующее читательскую эмпатию. Такая эмпатия, как мне кажется, довольно редко рационализирована. особенно у читателей женщин, которые составляли, как мы знаем, довольно большую часть читательской аудитории Карамзина, которые вряд ли свободно оперировали социально-экономическим каркасом и считывали его так свободно, как мужчины. Впрочем, вот здесь, так сказать, это вопрос. Вот, но, несомненно, это я заканчиваю уже, да, спасибо еще раз, вы замечательно как бы убрали, в качестве задника изобразили предшествующие чтения. В то же время, и в то же время их учли, да, это филигранная работа, спасибо.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Katya, for agreeing to do this. And as agreed with the Jordan Center, I will summarize Katya's remarks in English for the recording for those who don't speak Russian. Also, of course, many of you have perfectly kind of catch Katya's point without my help. So the three major issues, and they are the ones that I'm so happy to respond. They're very central for what I'm doing. So this is great. So three major issues, the way is how I understood them is the first is the question of how much, so the Poor Liza is a work of fiction, not an economic treatise. So how does this economic meaning, right, a set of economic meanings exist or not exist in other economic fiction outside of this tale, in Karamzin, the fiction that of Karamzin's imitators? How much is it present there, and how does it interact? Kind of, can we assume that it's there in other works which seem more primitive, right, than Poor Liza, specifically those written as imitations of Poor Liza? So that's question number one. The second issue is the issue of the narrator and the narrative, right? So the narrator is presented as Erast's confidant, an acquaintance. So is he a person like Erast, or is he somebody who exists on a meta level, who presents a meta vision of what is going on? And what do we do in this case with a very nuanced language, narrative language of affects and nuances, which the narrator brings into the story, right? If the plot exists outside of this is the narrator's work, how can it be connected to this economic interpretation? So that's second question. Is it superfluous? And I like this word. I'm going to get back to it once I respond. Is it superfluous? And the third is the question, again, very much central to this, is the question of the kind of aesthetic effect the reader responds to the story, if which seems to transcend the boundaries of very limited Smithian compassion, right, for Phaedra or other characters, right? It seems to be a very humanistic piece. It seems to inspire kind of a compassion which will be developed throughout Russian literary tradition, going to Dostoevsky as a general paradigm of compassion for a suffering human being, right? And is Karamzin can Karamzin be seen as a model for this or not? And what are generally the implications of this tradition of humanistic compassion that Karamzin starts? And I'll just go ahead and try to react to all of those questions.
Можно я еще последний вопрос задам?
Да.
Пожалуйста, вы меня выбрали в дискуссанты, потому что моя книжка называется «Бедный Жозеф».
Нет. Я вас выбрал дискуссанта, потому что вы замечательно знаете нюансировку бедной Лизы.
Окей, спасибо.
So yes, those are indeed a central question, right? So the first question is, how does this, can this be expanded to other sentimental fiction by Karamzin's imitators or his contemporaries? And that is again central because, as I stated in the beginning, my general assumption is that it is valid for all sentimental fiction in general, that Karamzin is just one masterful practitioner of a mode that exists across several national literatures, and Karamzin is perfectly is somebody who is perfectly situated to follow what's going on in French fiction, English, German, and in my chapter, I actually work with some of text written and published in those languages, right? So it is indeed my claim that this is always there in some sense, right? That economic meaning is always there. How does it work, right? I don't think that it works through the fact that all sentimental writers read economic treatises, although a lot of them did. There is, for example, literature on how in France, a whole sentimental depiction of peasants was tied to physiocratic economic thought. So basically the same people, for example, a translation of Thomson's The Seasons was dedicated to Mirabeau the Elder, who was one of the major physiocratic thinkers. So there is an intertwinement of discourses, right? That's been described for France. What about Russia? How does it work, right? I cannot say that I've read all imitations of Poor Liza, but what can I say about Karamzin's contemporaries is that economic themes are pretty explicitly present there. In Обитатель предместья, Muravьев's Обитатель предместья, it includes explicit praise for Smith's Wealth of Nations, and it includes a praise for the role of the merchant as somebody who drives the economy. So that's another case of how Smith and conduct is explicitly inserted in sentimental fiction. In a very different example, Pavel Lvov's Российская Памела, and of course, Richardson's novels are very much about money, about how sex relates to money. That's a fundamental theme there. There is a character who kind of wants to court platonically a peasant or a poor girl, and then he has an evil friend who says, well, shouldn't you just buy her? You can buy her. So there is this implication of a slave market being brought in. And obviously that is central to Radishev's sentimentalism, right? To путешествие из Петербурга в Москву, but also to the early text, отрывок из путешествия, 1772, Sentimental Journey, short text published by Novikov, отрывок из путешествия в три точки, which uses the sentimental mode as a way of interrogating the social conditions of serfdom. So those are several different random examples by different authors, right? Which basically I meant to just illustrate. Yes, that's a conversation that I'm very much interested in. But I would say that this conjunction of sentimental mode with social and economic thinking defines the very sentimental mode. You cannot leave it behind, right? It's always there. So that's my hypothesis at this point. So the question of the second question of the question of the narrator and the very nuanced techniques that he employs, which is absolutely essential. So what do we know about the narrator, right? We know that he is Eras's friend, which is a kind of an important, significant structural move, right? He exists in that very same space that as a person, right? That we'll see that later in Evgeny Onegin, right? What else do we know? We know that he shares the habits of those people who wander around Moscow. So he is a member of the same class as Erast. He shares those habits of consumption, but also we see him, the same narrator, basically in other Karamzinian texts that I quote, записки старого московского жителя, and that kind of that we see there that Karamzin defines his narrator, explicitly defines his narrator through his economic behavior, right? Karamzin kind of wants his narrator to demonstrate his economic behavior. It is less explicit in Poor Liza, but then once he starts explicating it, we can he invites us to look back on Poor Liza as a text which, as he's aware, everyone knows, and kind of fill in the gaps. So I definitely see the narrator as part of the same world that Erast, and the same part of the same economic setup, right? Why does it matter that he's telling the story rather than a character, right? Why do we need a narrator at all? Why cannot Erast tell it? Because in the last sentence, we actually have Erast we say that the narrator actually recounts Arast's story. So why cannot Arast be telling it, right? Because my response would be that precisely because of Smithian morality required a spectator. And it's not just Smith. It's not about Karamzin being influenced by Smith. There is a whole paradigm which Smith is a central part of, which starts with, I don't know, Joseph Addison, right? The spectator. You need a spectator to process whatever is going on in the world. You need a particular person who is looking on it, but this person is not, his position is not that of a great Russian writer, say, right? Dostoevsky or Tolstoy as moral judges of their age. This person is explicitly part of that same world, right? He has a particular social status. He's mostly, even in fictional cases, a landowner free from any obligations. He doesn't have to spend his life doing anything. He can watch and think and make his thoughts public. So that is a very particular moral and social niche. And then Smith theorizes this figure as a figure of our collective introspection. Through this figure, the society understands itself and how it works. And in order to do that, this narrator needs to give us access to nuance of affect, right? Smith's treatise, the first one called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, right? By the very title, we can see that it's all about giving a very nuanced picture of sentiments, of what happens to people, how sentiments develop, how they turn into one another, how they're judged by society. And the judgment is never in Smith, it is never straightforward. For example, and this is part of what I do in my chapter, I try to see whether Arast is actually guilty of a crime or of a transgression in Smith's categories. And basically, Smith's system is so complex that both verdicts are possible. In Smith's system, you can see Arast as somebody who's guilty of Liza's fall and death, and you can see him as somebody who all of those things as unintended consequences, and he's a well-meaning guy who just didn't know what will happen next. Both things are possible. So it's a very nuanced system of judgment, which Smith himself defines by the concepts of casuistry. Smith introduces this Catholic concept, as he says, the Catholics devised this very nuanced kind of classification of different moral conditions and situations, and they did it all wrong, but then Smith introduced his own version of the same thing. So this is why I think nuance, moral nuance, stylistic nuance makes a lot of sense in this perspective. In Poor Liza's kind of the point of this narration is that the society looks at particular things that happen and have a chance to form a judgment. And of course, we don't know, right? If the reader, I absolutely agree with Katya that the reader is compassionate with Liza, but then in terms of what we think of Arast, I don't think there is a consensus. I don't think there is a one single judgment, right? We can say very different things about Arast, and they will equally fit Karamzin's narrative. And that's part of that very well-nuanced structure that I think we're talking about. And yes, the last question is the whole issue of compassion as it goes through from Karamzin to Dostoevsky, and that's indeed a central part of my book. And I'll try to make this answer very short, although it's the topic, right? So compassion can be played out differently. And I think that sentimental fiction explores the different poles, right? You have the one compassion, Smithian compassion, which is, okay, let's limit, that's what Smith says very explicitly, let's limit our compassion for the poor because the economic system is good. We feel some compassion, but let's limit it. And then there is another compassion, which Белинский evokes in his letter to Gogol, ужасное зрелище страны, где люди торгуют людьми, and you have this ужас as a radical compassion, which is a revolutionary effect. Let's destroy everything. And both of those extremes and everything in between was present in Karamzin's time. Karamzin and Radishev is the couple that the pair that we've been discussing for decades, and I don't think we've exhausted the topic, right? The revolutionary Radishev and the conservative Karamzin, I'm oversimplifying here. And then if you map it onto Western debates around how does Smith's theory fits into revolution, all right? The revolution has just happened, right? So there are different ways of seeing this compassion and fitting it into the social mode. And the author and the reader are free to choose one of the different options. But what matters for my project is to outline this continuum and to say that the question of the market and of the revolution is never too far away. Last quote that I will, and I'll stop here. Last quote from Karamzin's письмо русского путешественника. In Lyon, he goes to the grave of the famous suicides, Teresa and Faldoni. Dostoevsky's characters will have their names, and he says, he asks around for their graves, and he says, никто не мог мне подсказать, где была эта могила. Французы были слишком заняты своей революцией. So this just juxtaposition of this famous suicide, iconic suicide, and the question of revolution, which is obviously absent from Poor Liza, is not absent from its context or from Karamzin's thinking. So I'm gonna stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kirill and Ekaterina. I wanted to say, oh, thank you, Sasha. So the chat is now open. Please, I wanted to ask you to, if you have a question, to just write, indicate that you have a question, or if you would like me to read your question, write it down. I will, this way we can follow the order in which the questions come up. So, questions. Monitor their appearance. There's usually a little bit of a pause at this point. Svetlana Grenier, please.
Yes, thank you, Kirill, for a really fascinating talk. And now we'll have to go and read Adam Smith, those of us who haven't. So just trying to apply what you're saying about the economic aspects of this to some of the other, famous sentimental works like Werther or even Clarissa. With Pamela and Poor Liza, there's clear, man, high placed and poor woman. But can you say something about those other situations?
Yeah, Pamela is obviously if I'm not confusing them, and maybe you remember that better, but I think it's Pamela, which is the model for the situation where you have the poor servant girl who is being pursued by her employer, right? And she ends up marrying him. But she manages to protect her, defend herself, kind of keep him off until he proposes. And in the beginning, you have this passage where she starts complaining to her parents, who are kind of those rural laborers, right, about his advances, right? And he starts giving her gifts, and she is worried and surprised. And this is, I think, much kind of a parallel to what Karamzin does. When Liza refuses the ruble instead of 5 kopecks, and in Richardson you have the letters that the parents write her, and they say, well, yes, you should be worried, as Liza's mother does. You should be worried. Evil men are always there to ruin you. And there are two elements in those parents' letters which struck me as very important. First of all, they insist that if he seduces her or rapes her, she will be guilty. She will be dishonored. So they are not offering her kind of any refuge from this urban. They don't say, come back to our natural space and forget all about it. It's impossible, right? This system of judgment is already in place. And then they talk about her chastity as her jewel, which is, of course, in diamond is in Smith, the symbol of price, right? The symbol of price formation. So they, again, the peasant parents already kind of economized the whole question of the whole issue of chastity. So yes, I think this is very, very, very relevant. In general, I've tried looking at everything that's been written about Karamzin sources. And I've tried looking at, obviously, text, as I said, written in different literatures. My general conclusion is that you cannot trace, and this is not meant as in disrespect of Karamzin. You cannot trace Poor Liza's sources because there's so many of them. It's so trivial. He masterfully pulls together things that are so commonplace that you cannot actually distinguish one source. So, in a sense, Mikhail Gasparov had this fantastic term, konstruktsii перевод, right? Where he says that the Russian literature makes shorter text out of huge Western traditions. So, Бедная Лиза, in that sense, would be a konstruktsii перевод of like 3 different national sentimentalisms, in a sense, acquiring kind of, including all different meanings from those traditions. I'm gonna stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next, we have a comment from Tatiana Smolarova.
Hi. Hello. It's great to see everyone. And thank you, Kirill, for a brilliant talk, and thank you, Katya, for your wonderful comments. I'm all the more touched by Kirill's talk that and inspired that my own last talk I gave at Jordan Center was somewhat rhyming with Kirill's topic, as it was also on partly on Karamzin and Adam Smith. So I'm, as for instance, in my Zoom picture, I see myself between Kirill and Katya. I'm somewhat replying also to Katya's comments. I think that actually, and that we, I think every time we meet with Kirill and talk about Smith, I think that, Kirill somewhat diminishes the element of compassion in theory of moral sentiments. And I would, for instance, choose different quotes, but I mean, from my point of view, but what Katya, you say, and I very much understand about centrality of compassion, and you mentioned the word empathy, right? And Smith's concept of sympathy, which is central to theory of moral sentiments, is somewhere in between of what we now understand by sympathy and empathy, without being actually one of them. But I think that it's important to understand that I think that these parallels with Poor Liza are justified, but also because theory of moral sentiments is much less of a treaty than Wealth of Nations. It also has important narrative dimension to it, and many kind of plots worked into this theory, which is not entirely a theory. And Kirill always mentions this limit of compassion for the poor, which I think is secondary in Smith, and not, I wouldn't zoom, pardon me this terrible word, into this that much. And I really think, well, not because I want to squeeze in my own thoughts, that really an important link between Smith and Karamzin is Marmontel. Marmontel, who was exact contemporary with Smith. There was 1 month different. They were both born in 1723. And it's curious that they both, the Contes Moraux, the moral tales by Marmontel, came out exactly in the same year than Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759. And so on both sides of the English Channel, these two questionings of sentiments in, if you wish, theory and practice, right, but which were both theory and practice in Marmontel and Smith. And then after that, several years later, they actually met in Paris when Smith spent 8 months in Paris in 1765-66, and he was in the milieu of the encyclopedist, and Marmontel among them. And so I think that Marmontel, with his definitely narrative approach to this, all these ethical problems, already, I don't know, digest and mingles many things, and then they are brought to Karamzin, and well, it's a commonplace how important Marmontel was for him. So I think actually it's really important in Kirill's work that that he shows that this economic and sentimental parts, that they do not eclipse each other, but rather complement them. And in this way, I really like what Kirill just said about looking at Poor Liza as an intersection point and конспективный перевод of three different traditions. So where it's really just a very compact version of all this. But I really think that we should not underestimate, I would say simply, the warmth of theory of moral sentiments, and the best works that is written on Smith by James Otteson, The Market of Life, is also a research, but a very warm book. And I think that that was important. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll respond. Thank you, Tanya, for coming. And yes, kind of our work it resonates, and I like this conversation that we are having. Yes, we do have indeed different views of the myth, and I just kind of, so I posted in chat a quotation I like about the limits from the theory of moral sentiments, about the limits of compassion for tragedy, but also on the way in which for Smith it's crucial that we don't actually feel too much compassion to the poor themselves. Yes, I mean, I think that, so my point, one of the point of departure for my understanding of sentimentalism is, of course, Marx, right? And general Marx's formulation, Marx's critique of socialist sentimentalism as a form of hypocrisy, right? And Marx has an early text on suicide, which is relevant, and I don't have time to bring it in. But yes, so my kind of, for me, Smith is valuable because his theory actually brings out the hypocrisies, that he's actually articulates what is hidden behind what, right? He says that, okay, so we see a lot of evil in the world, but we have to assume that everything is for the greater good. So he kind of, he fleshes them out, right? The hypocrisies of the order that he theorizes. And in that sense, I think he has critical value. But of course, we have, here we have just two different approaches to Smith and the whole problematic.
Thank you. There is a suggestion, a question from Hilde Hugenboom. Are you familiar, Kirill, with Rita Felsky's work on sentimentalism and empire, the humanizing of the already human peasants, poor slaves, etc.? Is that in the uses of literature, Hilde? I'm not sure where that is.
So yes, thank you. No, I'm not familiar with that book. I'll definitely look it up. There is another book on my desk.
Literature, I think, but
yeah, there is another book on my desk. I don't remember the author, about sentimentalism and empire in English and French. I think the author is different, and I'm not kind of.
So the next question is from Olga Mayorova. Please, Olga.
Thank you very much, Kirill, for this provocative, interesting, and convincing talk. So I'm very impressed by the connection that you make between the economic and sentimental discourses, and how deeply they are the kind of the common roots of these discourses that traditionally are seen as separate. But my question is short and simple. There is another dimension in Poor Liza. It's a historical dimension. You talked about Moscow capital as a horrible center that deprives the periphery or the provinces of everything. But there is another aspect of the image of Moscow, Vdavica. Несчастная вдовица, the widow who is suffering. And of course, this image of Moscow resonates with the image of Liza's family. So my question is simple. How do you connect? Do you see any connection between the economic and the historical dimensions of these story, or can you suggest any reading of these different discourses together? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olga. That's a great question. Yes, I haven't thought about the two widows, and that's very that's really cool, and I'll have to think about it. Yes, generally, of course, there is a connection. So the basic idea of how Smith, but also in Thompson, whom Karamzin translates, is that kind of there is a general history of progress, right? Which ends up in kind of this capitalist commercial economy, which is the economy of wealth and prosperity. And this progress starts, and this is the case in The Seasons by Thompson, with the kind of medieval ages where everything was bad and wrong and destructive. And then it ends up with a contemporary economy. So this is what is going on. And Karamzin in Zapiski Staromoskovskого Zhitelya, he explicitly traces the same kind of progress. So definitely the condition that we find Russia in Poor Liza is also part of its history. It's just kind of the contemporary stage of its history. That's where we are now. Now, the interesting part is that Karamzin refuses to associate Russia's modernity with St. Petersburg. That's a very strong move here, right? Because you would think that, okay, earlier there was Muscovite roots, whatever, and now we have Petersburg. Petersburg is just absent from this picture. And this is the more striking sense in Thompson, for example. Thompson praises Peter and Petersburg and Karamzin translates those huge, like several dozens of verses in Pismo Russkого Puteshественника, but he refuses to take them to mention any of this in Poor Liza. So the way I see it is that he refuses to associate progress and contemporary progress with the structures of coercion and bureaucratic empire associated with Petersburg, but instead, he associates progress with trade and capitalism. And if you look at how Karamzin writes about Moscow, contemporary Moscow of his own time, he constantly emphasizes that Moscow is central to Russia's whole trade system. So there is a kind of, this is a vision of progress that is both, includes the idea of the empire. It's explicitly there in Poor Liza. He says the Russian Empire, but this imperial vision is associated not with Petersburg, but with trade. And this is, I would say, an English kind of vision. He kind of transposes onto Russia the British vision, which associate imperial grandeur with commercial economy.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Alice Christ. I would like to hear more about the Verda question. Does it matter if suicide is male or female?
Yes, thank you. Great. Of course it does. There were just kind of a lot of suicides, right? And obviously male suicides have different implications. Yes. Werther is, of course, a socially motivated suicide, right? From the beginning, he struggles with the fact that he's not accepted into noble circles, right? That he's socially inferior. So there is definitely a social element here. It's just from that is different from female suicides because it can be said to be similar because he's also kind of ashamed of not being somebody he could be, right? Shame as an experience of your social inferiority can be compared here. But obviously it's different for men and women precisely because women are much more kind of victimized in the society. And Smith spells this out, right? Women are to blame for being seduced, for being raped, right? So there is the women become the ultimate victim. And even the suicide, which could be interpreted as a form of acquiring agency, right? It becomes a form of victimhood. And this is, I don't mean this as a final conclusion because there are different ways we can actually look at Liza's suicide as well. I just want to emphasize the way I see the difference between the male and the female suicide. There are German stories which are much more kind of textually, much more resemble Karamzin's story much more than Werther. There was this German writer, Johann Heinrich Spies, I might have mixed up the first name, and he has stories which he has short stories about suicides and women who kill themselves because they're being seduced. So there was also German literature which was outside of Werther.
Thank you. Okay, the next question. Oh, then there's the quote from Kirill. And then there's the next question from Maria Sidorkina. Forgive an attempt to put things together from your presentation without extensive background knowledge. Question: is compassion required precisely because the market, that is commodities, luxury, desire, defines the rural-urban male-female interface in a particular way? Is the thought experiment in Bедnaya Liza precisely the fact that we feel things even if it's no one's fault? Thus, nothing is to be done.
Yes, yes. So as I said, yes, there can be different versions of compassion, but for Smith specifically, kind of compassion is definitely subordinated to kind of, what's the term? To kind of the instincts, that egoistic instincts that drive commercial profit, right? Self-love, to self-love. Compassion is subordinated to self-love as a principle of economy, of the principle of capitalism, right? Smith has the famous statement in The Wealth of Nations that only the beggar can hope to get something from people's charity, but we, all of us, rich males, rely on people's self-love to give us what we need more. And even the beggar cannot actually rely on people's charity because there's just not enough of it to go around. People are not charitable enough. So in this system, of course, compassion becomes a way of looking at the system and feeling yourself a morally good person without changing anything. And this distinction between sentimental compassion and political action was very clear made very explicit in, for example, English polemics.
Yes, great, thank you. It looks like a comment from Hilda Hugenboom. Russia is a slave state like the US, and one feature of slave estates, plantations, where the real economic power resides, that undercuts city labor, is minimally developed cities.
Mm-hmm.
I think this was not, I think this was more a comment than a question, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hilda. Yes, that's definitely part of something I think about here.
Next question is from Richard Wortman. How does the transfer of the scene to a serf society affect your analysis?
Well, the interesting thing about Poor Liza is that it doesn't mention serfdom, right? It gives you a world. It gives you a world without serfs. Liza's father is his status is vague, but we can assume he is a state peasant. So he's like sort of free, right? So one way of putting it is that Karamzin is illustrating here a sort of utopia of how we should transform agrarian economy. And if you look at how Catherine's Nakaz deals with it, this is what Catherine writes, right? We should destroy all those peasant kind of serf communes, but make people independent proprietors. But then how does it work in the condition of a real existing serf-owning society? Well, there is no response to that. And Karamzin himself is definitely a vocal opponent of abolishing serfdom. So for him, serfdom does not undermine the commercial structure that he's describing.
Thank you. Okay, question from a comment from William Nicol. But then there is a strange inversion. Erast becomes impoverished and has to marry for money an older woman who has been desiring him for a long time, so he becomes the market commodity.
Yes, that's exactly how I put it in my chapter. Absolutely, yes. So the money are obviously capable of, the market is capable of erasing all distinctions, but this capacity of rich women, men that are being sold, yes, it's all there. But this capacity still plays out differently. It still does not, and this is a major tension in Smith, and he actually is explicit about it. Is the market a horizontal structure, or is it a structure that is actually includes hierarchical domination of men over women, of rich over poor? And so it's both things are there, both the market's capacity to erase those hierarchies and the fact that they stay intact. Erast does become a commodity in a sense, but he still doesn't become poor. He still is not turned into a slave, or he doesn't have to throw himself into a pond, right? So the hierarchies are still intact.
There's a question. Yeah, a question from Jennifer Flaherty.
My question is just following up on the idea you were just speaking about of compassion as a kind of compensatory limit point, right? Like this is what you get so that we don't get this other thing, which is more radical change. And I was thinking about that in terms of a smaller point that you made that I found really interesting about pastoral, but then maybe related to pastoral's link to sentimentalism more generally, that, you know, in this sphere, sentiment overcomes or is more important than physical need. So I found myself thinking about a kind of fundamental division that would kind of be talked about as a dynamic, and then maybe sort of hopefully reconciled. So, you know, so here sentimentalism is, or the pastoral as well, drawing on the body, right? Drawing on physical suffering in order to exceed it. So I started thinking about, right, like this tension, and then the way that sentimentalism in fact tries to solve this. And forgive me if you went over this, but I was thinking about how, you know, the idea that people have talked about in Smith is that, you know, empathy is what mitigates individualism, right? And this is what you're talking about with the kind of, okay, well, you can have compassion, and therefore we can have capitalism, right? And then it all works out. But in any case, right, it is an attempt to reconcile the two rather than to sort of have one overwhelm the other. And so anyway, I was trying to think through, I guess bringing in philosophical discourse here, but you know, how these fundamental modern divisions, like what the sentimentalist reconciliation looks like there in economic terms as well. So, you know, how that all kind of fits in, right? You know, one way of mapping them is like Hegel's property, you know, idea of property is bringing in kind of how these two things might be reconciled, you know, in both philosophical and economic terms. So that was one question. The other question was just about to go back to the idea of a system of collective judgment and the reader and readership, right, which is so important for sentimentalism. And I think it was Hammerberg who talks about how, you know, it's this huge shift from really intimate salon spaces to a more anonymous readership. And I'm just wondering, you know, what that sense of a kind of wide anonymous readership does to, you know, its ability to invoke shame. You know, what is it about that shift, I guess, just in sort of institutional realities and histories? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Great questions. I'm not sure I completely understood the first question, but one way to think about it is to say that kind of how do capitalism and compassion reconcile? They reconcile in the concept of property that you brought up is very appropriate here. They reconcile in the sentimental subject, right? And that is something that is not only 1790s or the 18th century at all. The sentimental subject is somebody who kind of feels this compassion while being at a safe economic distance, right? While being hierarchically and economically well off, right? So compassion is obviously comes together with superiority or inferiority and stigmatization, right? This is what Smith says, right? Somebody who needs charity is a wretch, is actually, it comes with contempt, right? And Smith doesn't always say it's a good thing, but he says, sometimes he even says it as it's a bad thing, but he says that's how it is, right? So you have the compassionate sentimental subject who has his property, right? Has household, and then he looks with compassion on those poor people and does help them. There is a passage in the Pismo Ruskие путешественники, Karamzin writes about the English. He says the English are very compassionate, but they think that everyone who is poor has brought it on themselves, so they are very cautious not to give any charity. Ужасная максима, something like that. He's like, use the word ужасная. And then бедность и порок, бедность порок. Here writes here about England, and then this comes up in Crime and Punishment, where Marmeladov says in his first appearance, he says, I know that in England there is a political economy, so poverty is sin, right? So this is kind of this is how compassion becomes obviously a way of a social oppression, a form of social oppression. And your second question was?
Readers.
Readers, right. So yeah, that's very interesting because obviously there is this authority of the public, and the text is addressed to them, right? They have to judge. They have to, we as readers have to sit in judgment over what's going on. And more of this authority is actually recognized by Erast because he tells the story to the narrator as a form of repentance. And then the narrator tells the story to all of us, right? And this corresponds to the mechanisms that Smith describes in Theory of Moral Sentiments, that people want to be forgiven by the public. So this is brought up, and obviously there can be different verdicts on Erast, right? We feel compassion for him too, right? There is a model of sort of not justifying, but forgiving him implied in the narrative, right? And this is what we do. But what is not up to us to decide, what is kind of, for example, Radishev offers his readers, and that's 2 years before Karamzin, before Poor Liza. Radishev offers his readers to sit in judgment over the whole order, right? How should we change this whole thing? Abolish this, change this, everything's wrong. And this is not the option that Karamzin gives us, right? He gives us a way where we can sit in judgment about Erast and weep over Liza, but we do not have the authority to actually question all of this order. And this is exactly how Smith puts it. We see a lot of evil, he says, but we know as intelligent beings, as people who can build their theories, we know that everything in this world is actually for the greater good.
While there is a break in the questions, I guess I wanted to ask Kirill also this question, and I guess it sort of, in my mind at least, it's an attempt to press you a little bit more on Richard Wortman's question about the serf society and the way in which this model is transferred to serf society, or it leads to in a state society, right? And in the sense that if you look at some of the British models for this, Pamela has already been mentioned, and the way in which scholarship of British sentimental fiction speaks about what's happening there in terms of class is by way of a discussion of two issues. First, class mobility for the middle class, right? The sense that you could, as a governess or as a servant, right, you could actually rise to become the wife of an aristocrat. And secondly, of course, and maybe even more importantly, moral superiority of the middle class. The moral superiority of the values of the middle class, the virtue of the middle class, as opposed to the nobility, right? And so what do we happen here? It's kind of an open-ended question, right? But what happens here in these terms, right? Is there a way to translate, first of all, well, obviously the not happening social mobility, but at the same time, possibly something like moral superiority still being asserted in a complicated way, potentially, for Liza as opposed to Erast. I just wanted to, I guess, to ask you to comment on this. Oh yes, and the second question, which is kind of related, is the question of, yes, you are correct that there are no serfs here in this text, right? But the fact that there are no serfs is a marked fact for this text, right? It's not just that it happens to have no serfs, right? It's an obvious, legible pushing out of the problem of serfdom, it seems to me here. And so therefore it introduces the problem of serfdom necessarily into our analysis, so has to introduce the problem of serfdom into our analysis, right? So those two.
Yes, so middle class superiority. I don't see any possibility for that in Karamzin or Smith. For Smith, there is he does identify, he does speak of virtue as a middle class attribute, but in this case, the story emphasizes the whole aspect of desire, which is so intrinsically destructive, right? That kind of virtue can be in the fact that Taras repents rather than just enjoys himself, right? Which would be another version of an archetypical character, a rake, right? A malicious rake who just enjoys destroying people's lives. So maybe that. But it's kind of the whole question of middle class is very interesting, because we, of course, say that there was no bourgeoisie in Russia. But then when you start looking into historiographies of other European nations, you find that kind of, for example, there is Sarah Mazur's book, which shows that there was no bourgeoisie in France either. So where was the bourgeoisie, right? What's going on here, right? And Habermas is actually very cautious. He doesn't speak about bourgeoisie in the sentimental context, right? He speaks of a class of owners, right, which end up being landowners. So there is a very specific kind of refashioning, and this is again a global process, not only Karamzin, not only Russia, refashioning of the landed nobility and their dominance in different terms. So we can see how this is probably kind of what's at stake here, as to the extent that Erast был богатый дворянин implies that he's a landowner. Right, but obviously the public sphere is associated not with the imaginary bourgeois, but the public sphere, the narrator, Erast, are noblemen, right? The noblemen are the urban middle class. That is something that we definitely see.
I mean, in a way, I'm sorry to take up too much time, but in a way, I feel like you know, Liza is the representative of the middle class in this text structurally, right? It's Liza who, the Spasilyanka, who becomes Pamela, essentially.
She doesn't. Liza doesn't
obviously
Pamela because she doesn't marry upwards, right, which means that Liza is not middle class. Liza is working class. That's a crucial difference. This is a story about a working class girl who has to earn her living through labor.
So is Pamela.
And up to a point.
Yes, up to a point.
Then she married up.
One of them marries the aristocrat, the other one commits suicide, right?
Yes, but she doesn't. So we can, in England, you can speak about governance as being in a transitional zone. Liza is not in a transitional zone. She's very definitely a peasant who has to earn a living by selling stuff or doing things in the city. She's a working class girl. This is about division of labor, and this is about how labor works, right? And for Liza, it doesn't offer any kind of mobility, right? She stays there. She doesn't even move to Moscow, right? When Erast is gone, she walks around the forest and everything, right? She stays in the rural spaces, right? So yes. But your question was about serfdom, right? About how it's marked that it's not there. It's interesting because I think that this can be parallel to the whole way of how the question of serfdom was conceptualized in the discourse of the Sira. In the beginning of the talk, I saw that Colin Lucky was here, who authored the book on the Вольное экономическое общество, where they tried to Catherine's idea was kind of to suggest in the beginning of the Nakas and those texts to suggest kind of to think a way out of serfdom, but then turned out that was not actually possible to talk about it. So it was circumvented. We tried to write about the agrarian economy in a way that sort of circumvents the whole issue of serfdom. And this is, in that sense, I just think Poor Liza is just reflective of how things were done. That's how you write about it. And the issue of how exactly Poor Liza fits was Karamzin's argument against abolishing of serfdom that he started kind of voicing later is a great question, but it's kind of a more speculative one outside of this particular text. He just didn't see a contradiction between capitalism and serfdom. It just, for him, judging by his text, there was no contradiction.
Thank you, Kirill. I am not seeing any further questions in the chat, and in any case, we are running out of time for our discussion. So, thank you, Kirill, once again. Thank you, Lamina for the discussing, and thank you everybody for participating.